obviously, for being my interlocutor, she will be the better half tonight. I am just thrilled to see so many people here at the Independent Bookstore and wanting to come and hear a little bit about France tonight. I will just read a few passages just to give you some flavor of the book, and then we're going to just have it out. This is un premier mot, a first word. Du vin, mademoiselle? The waiter inquired, moving the wine bottle toward my empty glass. He had come to our long table in steerage class with a bottle of wine in one hand and a white cloth draped over his forearm to absorb the inevitable spills as the ship careened back and forth. I had never had wine before. Raised by a non-drinking Protestant family, I was hesitant. It was decades ago, and I had come to New York from New Mexico to sail with a group of disheveled American students in the lowest possible class on one of the last crossings of the elegant ocean liner VSS France. The stately and dapper director of the study abroad program, Mr. Holmes, was an American who lived in Paris for several years. At about 6'5", he was a towering figure in every sense. He seemed to know everything about France, and I tried to imagine what it would be like to inhabit his body and his mind. He had so much experience with French language and culture. Plus, at his height, the view must have been excellent from up there. While telling us students that we could certainly choose not to drink wine, he reminded us that wine was a point of considerable pride in France, and that by refusing to try it, we would be rejecting an important element of French culture. The same was true, he said, of various French cheeses, 365 of them, one for every day of the year. And by the way, there are a lot more than that. I like cheese, but what to do about the wine? Dilemma. Why have I come on this trip with over 1,000 people, not one of whom I've ever met? I began to ask myself. As a child in New Mexico, I had heard Spanish, Navajo, Hopi, and Zuni spoken around me, and I loved learning expressions in other languages from my friends, but I had never heard French. When I was about 5 years old, my mother taught me an Americanized version of the song Frère Jacques, whose refrain, Sonnez les matines, which means ring the morning bells, or the bells for matins, the morning prayer, became, in our pronunciation, Sama la matina. Later, a Belgian singer in an international choir stayed with my family, and when she asked if I knew Frère Jacques and suggested that we sing it in a round, I answered excitedly, yes, of course. But when she began to sing, my jaw dropped. Other than the melody, I recognized absolutely nothing about the original song. When she sang those same words, they were so different and so beautiful. I was mesmerized. Years later, on that huge ocean liner, I reminded myself that yes, it was all terrifying, but yes, taking this leap was the only way to immerse myself in French. As I sat at the table with that wine bottle poised above my glass, an image popped into my head. Walking from our Spartan submarine-style rooms to the deck, I had noticed tables of smartly dressed people speaking French, drinking espresso and laughing, deep in discussion, as though they had all the time in the world. Well, we did have a lot of time, but how could they converse contentedly for so long? The same thought crossed my mind during the apéritif, the before-dinner drinks later in the day. For the French on the ship, the purpose of the voyage seemed to be the pleasure of the journey and of one another's company, while most of us Americans were ticking off the days till we landed. The French had an intriguing, relaxed insouciance about them, I thought, something we might be missing. My dilemma quickly dissolved, and I looked up at the waiter holding the bottle of wine. Oui, s'il vous plaît, I said. With that first glass of wine on the ship, little did I know that I was beginning what would turn out to be a continuing journey, enjoying wine to be sure, but more broadly, drinking in French culture and opening up to a new world. That was the first part of the introduction. Here's the second part of the introduction. Every American who has set foot in France has a story. Whether you've made only a brief stopover, done a quick tourist circuit, or lived in the country for many years. Hemingway had one, Gertrude Stein had one, and Emily, the character from the 2020s television series, Emily in Paris, has one. Yes, oh, what's really funny about that is that the French think, oh my gosh, we're so stereotyped in this, right? And they don't realize that the Americans are at least as stereotyped. Yes, French stereotypes are on display to some extent in all of them, but there's also a grain of truth in every cliché. Despite the American cultural baggage evident in all these tales, we learn from them, laugh at the characters' gaffes, relive our own experiences, and compare our own interpretations of French culture to theirs. The book I hope you will be reading sets out merrily to celebrate and continue this tradition. But my story will not unfold over a self-revealing year in France or end happily ever after in a marriage to a Frenchman or a Frenchwoman. Instead, with this book, I hope to sketch out my discovery and rediscovery over the course of a few decades of returning often to France of la joie de vivre, literally the joy of living. I lived in the country first as a student and later as a mother and a teacher of French literature and culture, sometimes in the context of directing a program for students abroad, and I think there are a few people here who may have been on those. While I run the risk, as the French literary critic Antoine Compagnon describes it, of exposing my own nudité, that is my own inanity, my own nakedness, I'll take a few paths through culture, memory, history, and fiction to capture at least a bit of the uncapturable French art of living well. Joie de vivre. The term evokes baguettes, berets, bicycles, Bordeaux wines, perfumes and parasols, cheeses and checkered tablecloths, elegance and ease. In short, what is imagined to be French. While these snapshots are certainly part of the larger picture, they seem only to scratch the surface of a culturally rooted concept. The idea of joie de vivre must be fundamentally French if English cannot manage to come up with its own term. Indeed, the word joie de vivre appears in Merriam-Webster's English language dictionary. So what is it about French culture that generated the idea of joie de vivre? The first French-English dictionary, which dates to 1611, includes a few expressions involving joy. Joie de papillon, or butterfly joy, defined in 17th century English as momentary gladness, and fille de joie, daughter of joy, as a pleasant sinner. But there's no English equivalent for joie de vivre. The first use of the expression can be traced to later in that century and then to Flaubert's novel L'Éducation sentimentale in the 19th century. But it didn't become a catchphrase until Émile Zola's ironically titled novel, La Joie de Vivre. It was published serially in the 1880s, and if you're looking for an uplifting read, this is not the one. Today, the term joie de vivre is too often associated with rarefied wine, sumptuous cuisine, and luxurious apparel, items reserved only for the white upper classes. But at all levels of class and society, the French seem to hold secrets to finding moments of joy in their daily lives. Why is this the case? And how can we, who are not French, grasp what constitutes this joie de vivre that defies definition? Just two other very brief passages. This is a chapter, yes, that's right, called Taking Time, Making Time. Remember that time is money, Benjamin Franklin famously wrote in 1748, expressing a sentiment that would become one of the foundations of American life. Managing time, becoming more effective, and maximizing profit remained the catchphrases of today's work world in the United States. The French, however, have a different approach. The verb profiter is revealing. It looks like to profit, but it actually means to make the most of, or to enjoy. This contrast speaks volumes about the two countries' differing attitudes toward time as something to profit from or something to enjoy. This distinction may at first glance seem dualistic, but I found that in its approach to history and to the world of work, French culture does bear it out. In the land of Astérix, the Gallic warrior of comic strip fame, the sense of time is linked to history, and history permeates the present in France. The street names in Paris send the most casual walker to other eras. Vincent Auriol, president of France in the mid-20th century, Claude Debussy, a composer, Dora Bruder, a Jewish Parisian girl deported and killed in a concentration camp during World War II, Marie de Navarre, a celebrated Renaissance writer, Sarah Bernhardt, or Sarah Bernhardt, the preeminent 19th century French actress, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a pioneering 18th century evolutionist, and Léopold Senghor, poet and first president of Senegal after its independence from France. How do you find your way around, my students sometimes wonder, when none of the streets are numbered? No Fifth Street, no 7th Avenue. Well, for starters, Google Maps notwithstanding, you learn at least some of the street names. What does it mean to see monuments or the names of important historical figures on every corner, every day? Somehow it must impact your sense of the world when you pass by Notre Dame, an 850-year-old edifice on your way to work or the market. Even in the smallest French towns, there are the ancient cathedrals, monuments, and streets named after their most venerable citizens. How do the French imagine themselves following in the footsteps of these cultural heroes and heroines? One possible answer is that the icons from the past become a part of one's present-day French identity. When Notre Dame was burning in April of 2019, I saw senior citizens and children alike weeping at the sight. It is an inextricable part of their history and their place in the world. History and time are woven together in other ways. The French paradox, as it's known, has been widely described as follows. French people eat heavy and fatty foods, including foie gras and cheese, but they don't get fat because they drink red wine. This wonderfully wistful theory remains to be proven, but for me, there's a more salient and intriguing French paradox. While history is woven into almost every aspect of their culture, the French also insist on the fullness of the here and now. The French language has a word for it, s'attarder, which means to draw out, to linger, to pause over. Could this be the key to the French art of living well, expanding time, being there, taking all the pleasure in that's to be had? Not so much seize the day as seize the moment and make it last. As we've seen, language often unwittingly reveals the value of a culture. In English, we spend and invest time on a project with implied monetary results. In French, one simply passes, devotes, or consecrates time. Whereas in English, people and even objects seem to be in a hurry. Politicians run for office, refrigerators and fans run. In French, politicians present themselves for elections, se présenter, and machines walk, marcher. Whereas Americans run out of milk, in French, milk is missing, manqué. In English, you give someone the runaround, but in French, you send them on a walk. Envoyer balader. Your cup may run over in the United States, but in France, it overflows, déborder. These examples are simply the tip of the iceberg. There's something profound about linguistic expressions that indicate a rushed sense of time on the one hand, and a more serene approach on the other. Anyone who's fought their way through the metro stop at Châtelet during rush hour, however, will probably disagree. Let's just say that the general principle holds. And this is the last section I'll read. And this is less related to la joie de vivre, but it's in a part on defining Frenchness. Like what is it that is sort of the kernel of defining Frenchness? I learned almost all the French swear words I know in the passenger seat of a car. One day, a group of us were riding in a car with my French host brother Bruno on a mountainous road near Valence in southern France. As we advanced in the narrow lane, another car was riding our back bumper and eventually succeeded in passing us. Furious because of the danger involved, Bruno decided to pass the driver himself to get even. Don't even ask. After this game of taking turns for a few rounds, windows were rolled down and new vocabulary words shot from car to car, echoing across the canyon. Espèce de salaud, bastard. Con, literally a vulgar term for female genitals, but in this context, moron. While the rest of us were trying to talk Bruno down, the other car, now in front of us, stopped and blocked the road, forcing us to pull over. Both drivers flung open their doors and bounded outside. The other driver, wearing a rumpled brown shirt to match his rumpled brown hair, became a cheetah, baring its teeth as he approached our car. Bruno, displaying his refusal to back down, advanced 3 steps. The cheetah and Bruno continued their less than amicable exchange, both gesticulating and turning brighter shades of crimson as they shouted even more new vocabulary words. Enculé, asshole, but it goes a bit further than that. Enfoiré, imbecile means, but it's from the word foire, for diarrhea. Then, without explanation, Bruno concluded the discussion by throwing his hands up and pronouncing, bon, c'est comme ça. Okay, so that's the way it is. Both men then spun around and returned to their respective driver's seats, as those of us in the car remained hauntingly silent to avoid escalating the duel. Each of the combattants proceeded to restart his car and calmly drive away, seemingly satisfied, as the rest of us exhaled a sigh of relief. It's not every day that you first fear for your life on a mountain road, and then learns 30-some swear words in the space of 5 minutes. Just when you think you know a lot of French, though, it turns out you don't. When living in an apartment in Paris on my own during graduate school, although I could carry on a long conversation about, say, Proust, I discovered the hard way that I didn't know how to say the most basic things like light bulb, ampoule, or socket, prise. More recently, when one of the keys on my computer was malfunctioning, I realized that I didn't know the French word for that particular symbol. After a little research and double-checking, as not all online resources are reliable, as you know, I headed to a computer store armed with my newly acquired French term, barre oblique. Easy enough, right? Making my way past the aisles laden with the latest notebooks and laptops and USB drives, I at last arrived at the repair counter. My problem, I explained to the technician, was with the barre oblique. He looked at me blankly, as though I had just said, "'Twas brillig and the slithe each hole." I repeated the term, trying to perfect my enunciation. Oui, la barre oblique. After a few moments of furrowed brow and grimaces, his face lit up. "Ah, madame, you mean to say le slash?" Yes, that's it. I meant to say le slash. The French remain devoted to their language, and they love it when we foreigners occasionally get it just right.
That's just delightful. I could do that for a while. I feel like this is the joie de vivre crowd. Like you're self-selected for the joie and the vivre. And this is, I think a lot, like for a lot of us, this is going to be our one shot at getting a semester abroad with Cathy tonight, right? This is it. So here's the lay of the land. We are going to talk amongst ourselves up here on the podium for a little bit. Then you are going to get your shot. You're going to have a Q&A time. You got your special questions. Get them locked and loaded. We'll have the microphone and hand around. Every time I'm pausing, I'm just thinking, do I know the French word for that? Nope, not that either. And then, but I do know this one. And then le vin. We will go to Cafe Barbette. Everybody's invited. They have been apprised that a stampede of us are going to come over, 8-ish or whatever. So if you want to have a glass of wine out there, I think they're opening up the trapeze bar, and then you can ask Cathy the important private questions you've been wanting to ask, like, how do I be you? So, all right, so Cathy, it was such a delight to read your book. I did read it. I might have read it all this weekend, but I did read it. Because I, like all Carleton students, just only do things at the last possible minute in the most possible way.
Kind of like the professors.
And one of the things that struck me, you know, again and again, is it's such a generous book and such an insightful book, and it's so much about your whole life and about how French has teased out little parts of your life, and it just made me think that how many of us just are always doing this. Like, if you spend your whole life in the law, you know things and you get shadows and you get parts of your personality that sort of you wouldn't have known except you see them in the aspect of the law. I have that with myself in writing. I've been writing for so very long, and like I just could talk about the writing things. But you start your book, as we all got to hear, at a particular point, which is that lovely cruise. I'm so jealous. Like, I wish that, or not even a cruise, it's a voyage, it's a passage.
Yeah, with churning oceans like that.
But I want to know the prequel. Like, what made little baby Cathy Yandell want to do that?
Well, from New Mexico, it's not obvious, right? Everybody always says the first thing they say is, how come you teach French instead of Spanish, right? But it was just this mesmerizing thing for me in terms of the language. And then later when I got to university, hi Mary. So later when I got to university, I just fell in love with French history and literature as well. And I also did Latin American literature, which I like very much, but French just kept calling to me.
And do you remember is the Frère Jacques, is that the kind of, is that your Proustian Madeline, or was there an actual Madeline in there, or was it?
It's all about songs, yeah. It's all about the sonority of a language. I mean, a lot of people, it's funny, I've been in different countries, and my family will be speaking French, and somebody will come up to us, and obviously they're not from here because they would recognize French, but they'd say, "What language are you speaking?" As though it were some musical thing, which it is. And I did music my whole life, so for me, French was like the most musical language. And I know there will be those of you who say, no, it's Italian. But, and I like Italian too, but I think it's the musicality of it that first drew me to it. It's the sonorous quality.
So it was first the music and then the French?
And yeah, and then the whole intellectual thing that goes with it. Yeah.
Okay, now I need you to dish about that passage on that ship. What were you doing? Were you in a bunk bed with 1,000 people? Were you running around on the deck? What were you up to?
No, we were down, as I said, in steerage class, the students, with, I don't think we even had, what do you call them, portals? Yeah, I don't think we even had those, but I was always on the top because you could walk around and be outside, and they said that if you walked around and you were outside, you wouldn't get seasick. And so I spent about 24 hours a day outside and didn't get seasick. But there were big storms. I mean, these were huge ocean liners, but the ocean's even huger.
And so, was it when you were in France on that first trip that you swooned and fell in love, and that was because it seems from the book, it seems like it was inevitable, it would always happen, like you must be in France. But was there a moment when you were?
Well, I had already been studying French, and so I already knew that I loved learning about France and things French. And I had a bunch of French professors at, believe it or not, the University of New Mexico. And because somehow French people really, are there French people here who really love New Mexico? Somehow, it's just the desert. Yeah, it's the desert and it's beautiful. So I had by that time I had met a bunch of French people in Albuquerque, but the tiny place that I was from, I just heard Navajo and Hopi and Zuni, basically, and Spanish, of course.
I want the movie version. I want to see you just walking in circles, talking to the seagulls. It just seems like such a, it's just so poetic. By the time I got to France and Paris, it was, just airplanes. That's all. It's like, it feels much less momentous. Like, oh.
Well, believe it or not, airplanes actually did exist when But this abroad program, it must have been cheaper at that time, which sounds really bizarre because it takes 5 days. But that's how the program decided to send us. I think it was because we were in these dungeon-like quarters, and they had to have somebody so that all the fancy people could be upstairs.
So there's just so many entry points to talk about your life and France and French. I think the joie de vivre, a lot of people are going to come to your book as a how-to, like how to be happier, how to have a little of that in France. And you do explicitly come out with that. Let's talk a little, talk a couple of tips and tricks and stuff. I love that you had children, like your children were little children when you were in France. Talk to me about something good about babies and France and having them in France, because it always looks so nice with all the little carousels everywhere.
Yeah, it's true that French, Parisians, as you know, are not necessarily going to be that friendly with you, but if you have a baby or a dog, suddenly people will be talking to, well, they won't actually be talking to you, they'll be talking to the baby or the dog. But it starts all kinds of conversations, and so Paris was a completely different place for me when I had little tiny children. They also went to school there through high school at different moments. So both of them went to kindergarten there. They both went to 1 year of grade school there and to a little bit of middle school, a little bit of high school. on various sabbaticals, because it was not so easy always for my husband and I to be separated and the girls to be away from their parents, but fortunately I'm married to somebody who loves international cultures as well, and who really wanted them to be bilingual, so that's what they are.
Oh, so the first tip is to bring some young children, so,
Or a dog.
And then, tell me, so, you know, you went from this sort of question, like, could there be wine? What was your, you know, what happened after that? Did you?
Well, then I bought Dara's Drink This.
That was many times. What, you know, so were you then just sitting in street cafes with your student friends and?
Yeah, but again, I was not in the slightest bit wealthy, so I was more the sort of picnic in the park type person, but as I grew older and went back, I was able to sit in cafes for longer. But
See, I always tell people that in France, everybody can buy wine. Like teenagers can buy wine, and it doesn't have this forbidden fruit, you know, vibe. Like you can just go and have a couple euros and make terrible choices when you're 12, and then you get on with your life. Was that your experience as well?
it's really interesting because they've changed the laws since I was there. It was more or less unspokenly 16 when I was there, so when I was there at 19, there was no problem. Now it's officially 18, which is adult, but I say officially underlined because high school students stop by a cafe frequently on their way home and get a beer or something like that, and they're not carded. But it is on the books now that
And would you
need to be
characterize
18.
that as joie de vivre?
Well, I agree with you. I agree with you that I think the forbidden fruit is probably not a good thing, and there's a lot more, I'm not going to say abuse, but I'm going to say repeated abuse of alcohol by young people in this country, because in France I found, I mean, one of the language associates at Carleton, who's 21, and I were just talking about this, and he and I agreed that somebody might overdrink in France at age 15, say, and then they get sick, and then they don't do it again, right? And that is not necessarily the case with American students. So I'd say that's a huge difference, and I wonder if some of it has to do with the forbidden fruit.
Yes, the forbidden fruit and the unbelievable American willpower, which works for us and against us at different times. All right, let's do a little lightning round. What has more joie de vivre, pain au chocolat or cafe au lait? That's hard.
They go really well together.
Correct answer. That is the trick. What has more joie de vivre? This is a little softball for you. Desk salad or leaving for lunch?
Oh, yeah, there's a part in the book about how there's a French law. If any of you've read the book, you know this, and you might know it anyway. But I have a lot of French friends who don't know this because I didn't know it till I was working on this book. But the French law says that you have to leave your workplace for lunch. By that it means desk. So that you can have a cafeteria, say, in your workplace, or else you go out to a cafe, but you cannot eat at your desk. And it seems to me that there's a really good reason for that, and that is that you get refreshed, you get rejuvenated, you get recharged, you have to go away and do something different. And, you know, this holds for everybody. You know, people who collect the garbage are not supposed to eat in that office either. So it's just, it's across the culture, very much the way vacations are across the culture too, because those of you who know about French law know that you are guaranteed in your first year, not after your first year, 4 weeks of vacation, and that is mandated by the government. You might know this and you might not. I didn't know this. The U.S. is pretty much the only northern industrialized country that does not require a certain amount of time off.
And that is not joie de vivre. Triste de vivre. All right. Tristesse. Oh, yeah. See, I did not take all of my terrible French had nothing to do with Cathy Yandell. She had nothing. The Minneapolis Public Schools went on strike about a year ago, and I wanted my kids to keep doing their languages, which are Spanish. Actually, my son is doing French, and so I signed up
Good
for
boy.
Duolingo, and I've been doing Duolingo with them, and I am just a terror. All I can really do is just go super all the time. It's just a nightmare.
That's a good start.
Is that? Oh, don't encourage me. And I was telling Cathy that the other one I would just be like, trop bizarre. Like, I just walk around and say that to the dog. All right, so more joie de vivre questions. Has studying French, has incorporating French in your life brought you joie de vivre?
Well, I think you know the answer to that. Here I am. But yeah, I think one of the joys, and this is a chapter that some reviewers say, well, I didn't sign up for this book to be this intellectual, because there's a chapter on different French painters and
A
sculptors.
book reviewer did not sign up for a book to be intellectual. That is not giving me joie de vivre. Keep at it, go.
And the other thing they say is what you just said, is there's not a little list of items 1 through 9. Here is how you find joie de vivre in your very own life. But I hope that it's extrapolatable. Is that a word? It's probably a word in French if you know. But I think that a lot of what I talk about is time and attitudes toward time. And also attitudes toward maybe not the intellect, but the mind that is at book stops. I mean, at book stops, right? At bus stops, you're going to see ads for books, and you're going to hear people in parks talking about books. And there are television shows. One of the most popular television shows, La Grande Librairie, is just about books that have come out, and there are all different kinds of books, whether they be about psychology or philosophy or sociology, or science or technology. So it's just part of the public culture, right, to talk about ideas. And at dinner tables, people get into the most interesting arguments. And one of the things I say in the book is a problem that I had with that very issue, which is that I started getting into a French mentality, which is, oh, I don't agree with that at all because here's why, A, B, C. And Americans, I had an American friend visiting, and I was with a French friend, and we were just, all three of us saying, no, that's not the case because of such and such and so and so. And she just stopped for a moment and said, you don't care what I think, do you? And we both just were taken aback because what had happened was, in France, when you're having an argument like that, you're talking about the argument. So if I say, boy, I totally disagree because here's why, and here's why, and here's why, it's not about you. Right?
Girl, I grew up in New York. I don't have to know.
Yeah, this person grew up in Minnesota. But seriously, if you can kind of distance yourself from the idea and just find the idea in itself interesting and worthy of kind of disagreeing about, then you learn more from it. And I think that's a big joy in a way, to be liberated like water off a canard's back.
Well, one of the things that really comes through in your book is how much you appreciate the public intellectuals, and then how much you appreciate the greats. Like, you like Balzac. Like, you're right there.
Balzac's, yeah, I like Balzac, but I love Baudelaire. I have a chapter called Sleeping with Baudelaire.
And now you know why you have to buy the book. And so I know, yes, as an American magazine editor person type, I know the impulse to make a listicle out of the ways to have joie de vivre, but that's almost antithetical to the whole point of the book. Is like, you're supposed to reconsider your notion of time. You're supposed to love where you are, engage with it deeply, check out of our self-imposed rat race / hustle culture. So the joie de vivre does not come from, like, step 1, get a beret.
Although sometimes my female students, after a few weeks, I notice they begin to wear scarves. And they look, progressively more and more French as the time goes on. It's very wonderful to see.
I'm not wearing my sneakers because I knew that, we're having a French event. You can't wear sneakers on a stage in France. That's inappropriate.
You can wear.
Les baskets.
Yeah, the basket.
Oh.
Yeah, we have the epitome of the Breton girl right here with her stripes and her white basket.
Purchased in
Perfect.
Monoprix.
Monoprix.
It's perfect. It's
I've been
perfect.
known to purchase clothes there as well.
All right. So was it? So this is really like intimate work without footnotes. Was that difficult for you to, go freely with into?
Well, I had to work on it. First of all, our older daughter said that I had to take out all the words that were more than 3 syllables. And there weren't very many because I don't know very many. But ultimately, what was really fun was not having footnotes. I gotta tell the truth on that one. It was just so amazing. Because I'd write something and then I'd go, well, how am I gonna justify that? And then I would step back and I would go, I don't have to.
It's Cathy Unchained. That's the secret title of this book. Yeah, so it's just such an intimate look at your wit and vigor and joie de vivre. I hate that I just said that, but that's true. And it's just such a nice book to read and be part of. And so thank you for sharing that. And let's open this up to some questions. We have some questions from the crowd. Anybody? Yes?
Cathy, I looked you up and you wrote a couple of books, or your name was associated with a couple of books before this. How is this one set apart from that, and why did you choose to write this one?
Well, I write books on Renaissance France, which is not exactly this. But that's my field, and that's what I publish in, and I get a lot of pleasure out of that. But I decided to teach a class once on the Paris program and once actually at Carleton called La Joie de Vivre, because I just thought that would be a cool thing to set a bunch of literary and cultural texts around. And in that class, were you in that class, Emma? Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, anybody else? I don't think I've seen one who's in that particular class, but I taught it only once at Carleton, and it was completely different from the one I had done in Paris because we were in Northfield and we didn't have quite the same resources that we had in Paris. But to tell you the absolute truth, a father of a visiting prospective student saw that I had a class named La Joie de Vivre, and he sent me an email and he said, how would you like to write a trade book about that?
Oh.
And I thought, I don't know if I can do that because I'm so used to footnotes. And I had to think about it for a while, and about that same time, my mother's retirement community asked me if I'd give a talk on Notre Dame, because it had just burned and I happened to be living there at the time. And so I thought, this would be great, I can learn a bunch of stuff about it for intelligent people who want to learn more about Notre Dame, and some of them already knew a lot about Notre Dame, but some didn't. And so there are all these different aspects of it, where you have the stained glass, and you have the history, and you have the whole fact that Victor Hugo, when he wrote his Hunchback of Notre Dame, that actually saved Notre Dame because it was falling into disrepair. So yes, literature does influence life, and all these really cool things. And I realized that talking to that group, not a group of colleagues internationally who happen to study the Renaissance, and not even a group of students, but people who signed up for this particular class, but just people. And I had so much fun doing that lecture that I recontacted the editor from St. Martin's Press and said, I'll give it a try. So, yeah, so then, of course, I had to do a proposal and send in a sample chapter and things like that.
Yes.
Cathy, you just mentioned you were there in 2019, and it sounds like you went first when you were 19. So, have you? Because I was there, I think, in 1986, and then I went back in the early 2000s, and things had changed quite a bit. But you were much more intimately involved with the city and with the people of France. So, have you seen any big or just little cultural shifts? Like, is France still very French and very different than the States, or has it become a little more like you can buy brownies in French patisserie, which I think is
We
horrible,
can't buy brownies, but you can buy brownie.
right, and chocolate chip cookies. So it's things like that. So is
And
it
you can't
still
buy
as
chocolate,
different?
you can buy cookies. And by the way, cookies That's only chocolate chip cookies. Other cookies are not called cookies. Good thing to know when you're there. That's such a good question, and I think if there are people here who are familiar with smaller towns in France, things have changed not nearly as much in smaller towns as in Paris, but that's cosmopolitanism for you, right? I mean, I've been told that if you want to speak German, you absolutely should not go to Berlin because everybody in Berlin speaks English. That's not true of Paris. It's not, I mean, someone will come up and say, sometimes to the students when they hear an accent or something, and they'll say, may I help you, I speak English, and then, in fact, they don't. But there's definitely much more an international flavor. As you say, you know, you can get cookies and so on. But I think fundamentally, once you get into families, once you get into people's homes, into their apartments, then you're back in a really French world. Whereas out on the street, it might seem like, do you agree with that, Sal? Yeah, so.
I speak only a little French, but I've had the unsettling experience of being in rural Quebec and not understanding a lick of what was being said around me. And so even though I could read things, so I'm curious, is there a similar dichotomy in terms of culturally?
Between Quebec and France?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What would be some examples?
Well, we happen to have a dual citizen Quebecois French person here. But just from my 2 cents, I think Montreal is much more cosmopolitan, as we were talking about with Paris. But I had a wonderful experience in Montreal in which I walked up to a woman, and I agree with you, the villages are speaking, sometimes they're speaking a different kind of patois or joie or something like that, so other things are thrown in. But in Montreal, I walked up to someone and I had been told, even if you speak both French and English, you should always, always address someone in French. So I walked up to a woman and I was sort of trying to find the town hall, and I was looking to see if this corresponded to that. And I said, pardon madame, vous pourriez me dire où se trouve l'hôtel de ville, s'il vous plaît? And she looks at me and she stands up straight and she said, un moment, s'il vous plaît.
Oh.
She was from Quebec, but she was an English speaker, and she was making every effort to give me all the directions in French, and I didn't have the heart to tell her she could have spoken English. But she suffered through it, and I just thought, you go, girl. Yeah, but their cultures are very different. I mean, I have a Belgian friend who says she loves Quebec, she loves Montreal, because, she said, it's the perfect combination between North America and Europe. So it's got all the friendliness of the United States and the outgoingness, but all the sort of profondeur, the more profound kind of friendships. I talk in the book about different kinds of friendships and how in France it may take longer, but it also gets deeper. So I would say it's very different, and it's definitely more American than France is, but it has its own culture too, that's distinct from French culture and distinct from American culture.
Poutine.
Poutine. Yeah, I know about that president of Russia, right?
Yes, you were to.
Yeah, I majored in French at Carleton in the 60s, and I can tell you there was
You beat me.
There was no course called joie de vivre. It was all French literature. There was no culture, and there was basically no history. It was all French literature. So I'm just exceedingly jealous of students now who get to study joie de vivre.
What did you like about French literature?
I loved French. I mean, and I similarly went to France on the French ship for 5 days, and I was down in Mysterious. And yes, and we had days when they were battening down
Did
the
you
dishes.
get the
because
wine? Did you take the wine when they offered it?
there was wine offered. Yes.
And you-
I was with the students way down below.
And you said yes.
I didn't say yes.
Ah.
Oh no, I got into trouble in France because I didn't drink, and people would give me wine, and I would say, it's not your wine. I just don't drink, and that insulted people so often that I decided I would give that up, and I learned to like French.
Yay.
But I have a question about joie de vivre. Do you see changes in that? Do you see the French people becoming less the kind of joie de vivre that you just described?
Well, there aren't the 2-hour lunches in businesses anymore, for sure. So in that sense, it's changed. But if you go to a wedding or you go to somebody's house for dinner, everything slows down again.
There is that.
So I think the work world, what you say is there's probably less joie de vivre in going out for lunch and making sure we take, making sure 2 of us finish off a bottle of wine or something like that. That's not really done anymore.
It is in the wine world, however.
Yeah.
Yes.
Every woman in here, and possibly some of the men, would like to know where you got the dress.
It was so kitsch. I saw it on the rack and burst out laughing. I just was laughing so hard, and the saleswoman came over to me and said something like, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm a French prof." And she said, "Oh." So then I knew I had to get it.
Where?
In Rochester.
Oh,
Minnesota or New York?
Minnesota. It is from our friend Carl, however.
And then, in a more serious question, have mistresses gone by the way, along with some of the joie de vivre?
No. I would, well, I have a chapter called 6 in the city and in the country and in between. Yeah, but something interesting has sort of happened about the public's notion of that. I talk about a French president who died, and maybe French speakers here don't know this word. I just learned it, but it's épectase, and that means dying while in orgasm.
Oh, wow.
And there's not an English equivalent. That's the truth. But it used to be, I think, like in the era of Mitterrand. Does everyone know the story about Mitterrand, who was the socialist president in the 1980s? And it was revealed during his presidency that he had a daughter who was already in her 20s, and that he had maintained contact with the mother, but I think just as friends, but he helped to raise the daughter in the sense that he paid her way through her education and so on. And the French people learned about that and they went, "Oh, okay." Because he had sort of done his duty, he had done what he needed to do, whereas you'll think back into the 1980s and Jimmy Carter, or late 70s, I guess, but he had something like lust in his heart, right? And that was the end of his regime. But I think today there's a little bit more notion of ethics that's associated with that. So some guy named Griveaux, Benoit Griveaux, is that right? I think that's right. I think it's Benoit. It's a B. Griveaux. He was running for mayor of Paris, but then all of his sort of sex messages got found, and suddenly they just some people just said, well, that was really a stupid thing to do. But he had to drop out of the race because he had sort of lost face. So I think maybe things are changing a little bit.
Sir?
I'm seeing more and more TV shows and reviews of books that are about Black French people. I'm wondering, is that having an impact on the larger culture? A lot of writers being featured and celebrated and winning Prix Goncourt and all that.
Absolutely, and by the way, the latest Prix Goncourt won by Senegalese writer is absolutely fabulous book. That was in 2021. But it's about Mbougar Sarr, and we're trying to get him to come to Carleton, actually. But yeah, I think a lot of the book is about how the immigrants have actually made France a better place to be. So how, you can get couscous, and some people say, I have a friend actually who, with no irony at all, said, well, couscous is a French dish. Well, it's just so present that people think, it did come from North Africa, it did come after the Algerian War, but
Well, in the book you talk about bakers who come from different parts of...
4 of the last 6 winners of the Baguette Prize in France, the baking prize, which the winner of which gets to supply the Élysée, the president's palace, with baguettes for the next year. 4 out of 6 of them have been from Africa, just saying. It's a blind test. Yeah.
How does feminism intersect with joie de vivre?
I think very well. The question is, if it does feminism intersect with joie de vivre? And there are a lot of movements.
I think you found it quite liberating.
I think, French always make fun of the Americans for Puritanism and worrying about all that and just, so I think there's a little bit of that.
It seems from the book that you felt that you were sort of not free to have a vigorous life of the mind back in New Mexico, but you were quite encouraged to do so in France.
Absolutely, yeah, that's true. And I think it's changed in some circles, more in this country than it was, but I still maintain that France, has a lot more going on in the public eye having to do with intellectual things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of on that point, you mentioned the importance of literature and reading, and also the importance of music early on with language and that side of it. I'm really interested in classical music, and I'm curious how that side of culture might be more present or play that kind of role in French society as well.
It is. I mean, I sometimes listen to the classical music station there, and France Culture has changed, I think, in a good way. It still has classical sort of interludes, but it also has just very eclectic things happening. And there's a newish concert hall that is just magnificent, the Philharmonie, and I've heard both classical and African concerts there. Just amazing space. So I would say that classical music still has a really important role, but that, say, the Salle Pleyel, that always used to be only classical, that's actually, and I've seen classical things there, but that's actually where I saw Gaël Faye. I don't know if you know Gaël Faye, but he is a Rwandan origin pop singer who's very cool.
Well, I feel like, and it's not my take of joie de vivre, but just having more time off allows people to experience more art and music.
Exactly.
More time off. More time off. Yes.
So first, thanks for the book. Second, thanks for educating and, energizing, enthusing more than a generation of Carleton students. I took your class in literature 40 years ago. I can still name every book you read.
Oh my God.
And they were started with Francis So here's the question. My understanding is that the best French, kind of the center, the cradle of French, is there whether it's right or wrong, is there a place you'd pick out in France where you'd say, you go here, you're going to see the most aspects of this joie de vivre?
Ooh, what a good question. So you say Tours?
Oh, I just said that's for the language, but I don't know.
Everybody says that for the language, that the purest French language is in Tours, and all of my friends who live in Tours say the exact same thing.
And that's all, they say the purest English is in North Dakota, and that's how they got Tom Brokaw.
I thought that was supposed to be Ohio.
No, Tom Brokaw.
Where would you go?
I would go all over. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. As for accents, there's still accents in the South, I sort of say the Sud, but that gets back to your question about the differing languages, because there's less difference between the South and the North today than when I first started going there. And why is that? Because of social media, because of having all these things online and all the national radio stations and everything are in more or less Parisian French. So you don't have as much variety as you used to have. But it's just so different. I mean, France is even topological. If you travel around France, it's the size of the state of Texas, and if you've ever driven across Texas, you realize that it doesn't change all that much. But in France, in a sort of 2-hour period, you could be in mountains, and then you could be in something that looks like the Grand Canyon, the Gorge du Tard, and then you could be at the ocean, and then you could be at the Alps. And the towns are like that too, and I think the mentalities are a little bit like that. I mean, that's why the first thing I said tonight is, oh, Bretonne, when I saw her striped shirt, because there are certain things that are associated with certain regions, and I want to visit them all. Thanks for the question.
Will you go back to live there?
Well, all of next year, yes. So, beyond
Can we
sabbatical.
all come?
Not at
In
the
Paris
same
for
time.
part of the year, and Montpellier for part of the year.
Will you be interested in doing any private tutoring?
Talk to me later.
All right, I think we'll just do like maybe one more question, and then you can get your book signed by Cathy, or you can come with me to Barbette and have wine, or you can do both sequentially. That would be the best thing to do. Okay, who gets the last question?
Or, Dara, they can hear about your book that's coming out.
You can hear about my book that's coming out. It's called The Essential, dear Dara, 25 years of me. My entire dining room is full of stuff. I wrote a lot of things, a lot of them, couple million words, I believe, and now I pulled out 100,000 of the best. The best of the best. And they are in a book, and we are doing the copy editing, and it is a Carlton on Carlton procedure because Josh is the editor of the Minnesota Historical Society Press. I am history. It is just, you're going to want to get on the ground floor of this one, I'm telling you. All right, so who gets the last question?
Over there.
Ah,
Hello, kind sir.
I'll try to be
One of my
quick.
favorite students, too.
Oh. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more, so not a direct question, very open-ended, about some of the difference between what might be a study of another culture's art, another culture's web vehicle, and the interaction that happens perhaps between you and the art, you and the web vehicle. So you're a very particular person, leaving a particular place, seeing yourself in a new light, I assume, seeing yourself in a light that you like. Like you look in the mirrors in France and you like what you see in a way that maybe you don't like what you see when you look at the mirrors in your home country. Maybe that's not quite right, but to create a sort of a metaphorical image. And it reminds me somewhat of when I read Baldwin sometimes. There's this like, something about who I needed to be wasn't possible where I was from. And when I got to this other place, I was able to be who I needed to be. So I'm wondering if like you could distinguish that from, so this is joie de vivre as Cathy sees it in France versus this is the French joie de vivre. Cathy's not in it at all.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and the Baldwin comparison is really interesting. I think that you are a different person when you speak another language. And that's why I'm glad to hear that some people here are studying French, because if you take it for a term or two or a semester or two, you probably won't feel that. But when you get just a little bit more advanced, I have students sort of at the intermediate level that say, I had my first dream from and that you are inevitably a different person. And the reason you are inevitably a different person is that you can't think the same way if you're thinking in that language. And so I don't know if it's a better person. I don't actually like the looks of the person I see, whether I'm in France or Turkey or the United States. But, and I don't even know if I see a different person. But I do think that, I have this sort of image near the end of the book about an African log and a river, and the African,
Crocodile.
what?
Was it a crocodile or something?
Yeah, the African proverb is, a log can stay in the river for as long as it wants, it will never be a crocodile. And that's me in France, so that I'm never gonna become French, and although I started out wanting to be, that's not where I am anymore, but that log, its DNA is gonna have some of the marks of having been there, and I think that's true for anywhere you've been for a long time or lived, that you carry some of that with you, so you are a slightly different person. And I don't know if I'm a better person for having lived in France, but I certainly have a lot more ideas about joie de vivre than I would have.
I can wrap this up perfectly with that wonderful stepping up point. So John Le Carre says, if you have another language, you have another soul. And your soul in another language has more joie de vivre. And y'all could get it too. All right.